Daniel Rubio, welcome to the podcast. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
So, the topic of today's discussion is somewhat self-serving. I sent Daniel a paper that I have written. I'm about to submit for publication to a journal. And I said, can you just tell me what you think of it? We'll record a podcast where we discuss my ideas and see what you think, and it will help me write a better paper in the end. So the premise of my paper is looking at a specific instance of the gap problem facing theistic arguments. So you can think of any famous argument for God's existence, like the cosmological argument or the design argument. And one objection to those arguments is to say that even if we grant their conclusion, there is still a gap between the theist's desired conclusion and the actual explicit conclusion of the argument. So, for example, you could say in the case of the cosmological argument, even if you can prove that there's a personal, necessary being that's the ground of all existence, the ground of the universe, we still want to know why we should think that that being is God, why it should have the other divine attributes. Okay, so I wrote this paper to look at the gap problem in the specific case of fine-tuning, the fine-tuning argument, which says, so the fine-tuning argument would say that cosmic fine-tuning, the fact that certain features of physics are such that slight variations to the values of those features would render the universe life-prohibiting. The fine-tuning argument says that that's good evidence for a designer of the universe. And so then the gap problem in this context is to say that even if we grant that there's some sort of cosmic designer, why think that it's God? And so what I do in this paper is I look at four somewhat non-standard hypotheses that could potentially explain fine-tuning better than what we might call like traditional theism, the thesis that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God. And that might explain it better than just appeal to brute facts. This is usually the way naturalism is construed as an alternative hypothesis, is just to say that, oh, well, fine-tuning is just a brute fact of the universe. The universe is all there is, and there's no deeper explanation. And so then advocates of the fine-tuning argument will say that robust theism is a much better explanation of fine-tuning than brute facts, or appeal to a multiverse, for instance. But that conclusion is only significant if we've considered the whole range of other alternatives beyond or between these two hypotheses. So that's the big picture framing. Daniel, do you agree with that basic premise? Is that kind of how you're thinking of it too?
I have a couple of comments on the way you framed it.
Okay.
So the first comment is just to kind of elaborate on the gap problem.
Yes.
Which, like, to some extent is mostly just an artifact of the way philosophy of religion is taught as opposed to being an actual problem.
Okay.
If you look back at a lot of traditional natural theologies, just to pick one totally at random, say like Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, there is a cosmological argument, and the cosmological argument gets done relatively early in the book, at which point he then says, all right, so we got to our necessary being, first cause. In his case, the simple being is where you go. Now we've got to prove that it's God, and there's a whole rest of the book in order to do that. Yes. And most of the time when these arguments get taught in like Introduction to Philosophy or Introduction to Philosophy of Religion courses, people ignore the whole rest of the book, and Aquinas has a whole rest of the book. Duns Scotus has a whole rest of the book. Pick anybody who did an argument for the existence of God, kind of classically. They've got a whole rest of the book in which they try to move, by the argumentative standards of the day, which tended to be moved deductively from relatively sure premises, to the conclusion that you get something that looks like the God of whatever religion we're finding. It's an Islamic philosopher, they're going to the Islamic conception of God. If it's a Jewish philosopher, they're going for the Jewish conception. A Christian philosopher, they're going to Christian, so on and so forth.
Right.
But this is long and involves a lot of really complicated metaphysics, so we tend to skip that when we're doing intro stuff.
Right.
Whereas, so that is sort of the traditional thing. Design arguments are kind of oddly placed within the sort of traditional taxonomy of arguments for God. They've been around for a long time. They weren't the like scholastic workhorses that the things like the cosmological argument were, in part because that gap problem is way harder for a design argument. This is a point that Hume makes really well in the Dialogues on Natural Religion. Like most of the time, your Aquinas, you get to your Actus Purus, You then have a bunch of really complicated Aristotelian metaphysics to deploy to start getting your other divine properties. And you get them in not necessarily the order people would have gotten them, because you go kind of for the controversial ones like impassibility and aseity and eternity first. But in a design argument, you don't really have that, because you can like start to infer some features of the designer from properties of the design-ish, but like just look around at artifacts in the world, try to figure out the qualities of the artist from the art that they produce is going to be extremely hit or miss. And you're definitely not going to have the like level of certainty of a demonstration that was traditionally the goal in these sorts of things, which is why I think design arguments have been less prominent in the pre-early modern tradition. They've gotten more prominent kind of as science has become more of a autonomous, better developed, more effective way of doing explanation, because design arguments often have a kind of scientific patina to them.
But you would agree then that in the case of fine-tuning that specific design argument, there is more of a serious and prominent gap issue. How we go from just evidence of design to like robust theism to traditional theism.
Yes, I think in the case of design arguments, there's a more, like, in this case, the gap problem is not just an artifact of not teaching half of the book.
Okay.
It's actually really hard. William Paley tries it. He's probably the most prominent. He's using a biological design rather than a cosmological design argument, but it's like the same structure. It's the structure you want to see and that you don't see enough of. Now, I do want to push back a little bit on the claim about significance.
Okay.
I do think it's significant if you can take out single universe atheism, the hypothesis that tends to be the contrast case. I think that's significant both kind of sociologically, because like if you look at the history of thought in the 20th century, that is the king, so to speak, in metaphysics. That like other paradigms, you have to justify working on. You want to work on idealism, you have to justify working on idealism. You want to work on theism, you got to justify working on theism. That paradigm, single universe atheism, fitting things into that motivates research problems. I'm going to go naturalize this, that, and the other thing. You don't have to explain why naturalizing stuff is good in order to make that your research project. Everybody just kind of knows that that's one of the things that you're supposed to do. So taking that down, and if the fine-tuning argument works, it's not like, oh, it makes it somewhat less likely. It's like, this is an insoluble problem that we now have to replace the whole paradigm with. That's non-trivial.
Yes. Okay. So what you're saying implicitly, the point you're making is that if you can show that one explanation is far more likely than another, so if you can show that explanation A is far more likely than explanation B, by itself, that doesn't mean that explanation A is likely. Maybe they're both terribly unlikely. But if you can at least show that A is more likely than B, that's good grounds for ruling B out. Even if we can't then go ahead.
Not necessarily in full generality. Like, there are going to be lots of little toy cases where that doesn't work. But when you show that explanation B has got a really bad problem that it's not likely to solve, like that by itself, without any comparative claims, is going to take an explanation out. So like, I think of fine-tuning, like where we've come in the fine-tuning dialectic, less as that we've got a super strong argument for theism. I think that's still a live question. More that we have a super strong argument against a particular version of naturalism that was sociologically dominant for a long time.
Yes. So what I mean, though, is that if you can show that the probability of robust theism, the posterior probability of robust theism, is greater than the probability of single universe naturalism, you've ruled out single universe naturalism in that respect. Now, they both could have a very low probability, but you know that between the two, you will at least go with robust theism.
Yeah, you've at least given yourself really good evidence.
Right.
You can't do ruling out until you combine all the evidential streams, and that gets super complicated.
Right.
But yes.
Right. Okay, so I agree with you. But I think you're right. I need to temper the point I make in the introduction about significance. I guess my impression, though, was that most of the discussion has moved on. This might not be right, but most of the discussion has moved on from single universe naturalism or atheism to where it seems like the most popular alternative explanation is the multiverse. And so
it is.
And so, okay. Either way, I'm still realizing I need to temper my my comments about significance. Okay. The problem
People
I'm
move
getting
that way, but when they do that, they're pulling a fast one. Like you can't just watch the king go down and go, well, we got an okay prince.
Right. Okay, so I will need to make that more explicit. But having granted that, we still will want to know, even if we've ruled out single universe naturalism, there are a whole range of conceptual options left that aren't traditional theism. And we have to do our due diligence to consider those possibilities. I think that a lot of philosophers, theistic philosophers, will dismiss these more exotic alternatives because they're not as popular. But my intuition, well, I know this to be the case, popularity is no necessary mark of truth. And so it just doesn't matter if these alternative in-between positions aren't popular. That by itself, that doesn't do anything to show why they're false, right?
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay.
Most of these are just kind of badly underexplored.
Right.
And you can tell that in your paper because you can associate specific names with each of these views.
Yes.
Whereas, like, if you tried to associate robust theism with a particular name, that would be ridiculous because there have been so many people who worked on it.
Right. I mean, I think, for instance, so one of the explanations we will look over is the simulation hypothesis, the idea that our universe is a computer simulation. And the reason that it's fine-tuned for life is that the simulators in the universe, the next level up, wanted our simulation to have complex structures like life. So far as I'm aware, there's really only one article-length exploration of that possibility in the context of fine-tuning. So it's very easy to be like, yes, this individual there. So that you're right, they're underexplored, which made it more difficult to come up with assessments of these hypotheses because they're still underdeveloped. But I guess that's what you do. That's how you go forward. One small step at a time.
This is how literature develops. Somebody comes along and says maybe the simulation hypothesis, and somebody else comes along and says, well, what about X, Y, and Z? And
yes,
hopefully some simulation fan is going to come along in response to you and go, well, here's how we can address this one.
Yes. All right. Well, with all of the stage setting in place, let's consider the first non-theistic explanation. And in this case, it's the simulation hypothesis. So as I just said, it's the thesis that our universe is literally a computer simulation in a parent universe, so to speak. And it's fine-tuned for life because the simulators designed the simulation in this case to be that way. That's the hypothesis in a nutshell. I suppose I will first ask, is that a correct characterization of the view?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So it's interesting because Mizrahi is the philosopher who proposes this hypothesis as an explanation for fine-tuning. And his basic case is that it's at least better than theism as an explanation. And he goes through various criteria of theory comparison that he says scientists use when assessing theories. And he says that when you go through these criteria and assess the simulation versus theism, the simulation emerges as better. One point he makes is that the simulation hypothesis is testable. It makes empirical predictions in a way that theism does not. And here what he makes the point that our computer simulations have, what would the point be of how you phrase this? A smallest energy scale? That it's not, our simulations are not perfectly continuous. And so we would, if our universe is a computer simulation, we wouldn't expect it to be perfectly continuous. There would be a smallest fundamental unit that we could discover. And then he cites a few articles that maybe we've discovered those cutoffs. And my point was that testability as such really only matters in the context of like empirical science, that most of the time in philosophy, large-scale metaphysical views aren't testable anyway. And so the mere fact that one is not by itself significant. And then I made a second point that, at least according to David Chalmers, there's no robust reason to think that a computer simulation that simulated our universe couldn't approximate continuity to any precise degree and to any arbitrary degree. And therefore, it's not really the case that simulation predicts what he calls pixelation, that smallest scale. So that's kind of the idea. Daniel, did you have any comments?
Yeah, so one thing that's always worth thinking about, especially in the context of something like the simulation hypothesis, is exactly how much rope you're going to give to your anti-skeptical impulses. Like
Okay.
offhand, it's hard for me to see a difference between a simulation hypothesis and like a brain in a vat hypothesis.
Yes.
So if we're entitled to dismiss the brain in the vat because it's not normal or because it's unlikely, or pick your favorite form of anti-skepticism, not at all clear to me that the simulation hypothesis clears that bar by stipulating that we are entirely digital minds instead of merely analog minds in a nutrient bath. So that's one point to make. We should, like,
Yes.
as philosophers, we should all sit down and decide, is this wildly improbable or not?
Yes.
Because if it is wildly improbable, we don't have to think very much more about the simulation hypothesis any more than we do about brains and bats.
Yes.
If it's not, then like we need to reevaluate lots of things, because if we're gonna say the skeptical hypothesis is kind of plausible, well, now what do you do with skepticism? So that conversation hasn't been had to the extent that it should, and that's one thing that, like, if we're putting error bars on how we assess the initial plausibility of these hypotheses, you get pretty big ones on the simulation hypothesis. Just if, like, maybe there's a principled distinction between it and more traditional skeptical hypotheses. If so, I would like to see that point made more explicitly.
So I initially agreed with you. That was the first formulation of my critique, because one of the other criteria, it seems like we agree on testability as such, but one of the other criteria that Mizrahi appeals to is coherence, which is degree of fit with our general background knowledge that we take for granted before examining the specific fine-tuning evidence, just our general background knowledge about the world. And my point was that most of us, originally I said most of us think we're not in a simulation, but that's question begging in this context. My point then was, I take it that we have good reasons to think that we are not being deceived by an evil demon, or that we're brains in a vat being stimulated by electrodes to merely imagine that we're in a physical world.
Right.
Or that we have good reasons to think that we're not dreaming right now. Now, if we have those good reasons, then it seemed to me, unless something more is said, those same reasons will tell against the simulation hypothesis. Those same reasons will give us strong grounds for thinking that we're not in a simulation. But what I said then, what I realized was, after reading David Chalmers' book Reality Plus, it seems very plausible to me that in the near future, we will have unlocked the possibility of near perfect immersive simulations. And in that case, it's no longer clear to me that we can just dismiss the simulation hypothesis as wildly improbable. Because if I imagine myself being plugged into a near perfect immersive simulation, and then I'm unplugged and I come back into the real world, I think it would be irrational not to then think maybe the world I'm in now is also a simulation. And so for that reason, I don't think we can rule out the simulation hypothesis as unreasonable. I would like to, and so if you have a way around that, do tell. But that was the progression of my thought.
So this reminds me a little bit of the Boltzmann brain problem, which is also supposed to be this kind of, look, here's a skeptical scenario that's not wildly implausible. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, here's the Boltzmann brain problem in a nutshell. Statistical mechanics tells us that entropy goes up, that's the second law, and then we hit an equilibrium state, but we don't stay at perfect equilibrium forever and all time, everywhere. You get these flashes of order that appear in the disorder, and then most of them vanish right away. But if you've got an infinite universe, and that doesn't necessarily mean an infinite future, it could be spatially infinite, and then everything that was going to happen in a long future timeline will just happen side by side, separated space-wise instead of time-wise. But if you've got an infinite universe, statistical mechanics says that these fluctuations are going to generate anything with non-zero probability. So any sequence of events with non-zero probability is going to show up someplace. Anything with non-zero probability, which means most of the consciousness in the universe are going to be these, what they called Boltzmann objects, because it was Ludwig Boltzmann who first figured out this issue, who first stumbled on this issue. So it often gets put in terms of Boltzmann brains, because that's going to be one of the most common conscious objects in the universe, of these little brains that appear in a sea of high entropy and then disappear just as quickly, but maybe long enough to have an experience or two. But you don't just get brains, you get Boltzmann planets and Boltzmann solar systems and Boltzmann periods of 5,000 years. So all you need for that is statistical mechanics plus an infinite universe.
Yes.
if the thought is that that's not wildly implausible, then it looks like most of the, like, we take ourselves to be on the initial entropy gradient, 14 billion
Yes.
or whatever the astronomers say from a Big Bang type event, nearish to the very beginning of the universe. That's what we take ourselves to be. And most of the consciousness, including most of the consciousness with our exact phenomenal states, is not like that. So then you have a decision. You can either go like, that's skepticism, we can't deal with that. Or you've got to say something else about why that's bad. So like Sean Carroll thinks the reason why that's bad is that if we were to accept that we were Boltzmann objects, we'd undermine our evidence for statistical mechanics. And so it'd be this sort of self-consuming hypothesis, which then, so apply that back to the simulation. Is the simulation hypothesis self-consuming? If it's not self-consuming, like, the question is, can the simulation hypothesis survive the gauntlet of anti-skeptical moves that have been introduced, including the newest ones that have been used against or in the Boltzmann brain problem? I haven't thought about it super carefully to know if I want to say absolutely that it can't. My suspicion is that somebody's anti-skeptical argument that's not that implausible is also going to be a big problem for the simulation hypothesis.
It might. I think that in the case of Boltzmann brains, though, I don't see how that undermines my point, because typically, if a model or theory implies the widespread existence of Boltzmann brains or implies that we are Boltzmann brains, that's taken to be a problem for the theory, a fatal flaw in the theory. I don't know anybody that thinks that we have plausible evidence for Boltzmann brains, and therefore maybe we are Boltzmann brains. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't seem to be parallel to the point I'm making about simulations.
Right, but that's mostly a sociological point about how people have reacted to this idea versus that idea. Not that like the underlying mechanism that makes Boltzmann brains, statistical mechanics plus an infinite universe, that's not implausible. At least I wouldn't have said so before somebody told me about Boltzmann brains. Likewise, if you think like the underlying mechanism for simulation, which is just like really sophisticated VR or really sophisticated computers, that's also not implausible. So then, we get this choice point. Are we going to have anti-skepticism strong enough to deal with this, or are we going to kind of have to revise? And I'm not totally sure what the right direction to go there is, but I do think they're going to rise or fall together.
I see what you're saying. Okay, this warrants a good footnote or a paragraph in the main text. But I think the warrant in either case is different. We have not discovered a Boltzmann brain or actually discovered the widespread existence of Boltzmann brains. We have some grounds for inferring them from statistical and mechanical considerations. In the case of virtual reality, if I plug myself into a machine and I'm suddenly in a completely immersive simulation, that strikes me as a far greater degree of warrant for the relevant skeptical scenario than kind of these theoretical considerations about Boltzmann brains. And so it might be the case that our anti-skeptical justified reasons and beliefs outweigh the theoretical postulates of Boltzmann brains. But seriously, if you plug me into a simulation and then I got unplugged, I mean, what do you think? How would you react? Or I guess not the psychological question, but how do you think we should analyze that rationally? I would think we suddenly should really think, well, maybe right now I'm in a simulation.
I mean, partly it will depend on how good we are at telling whether we've entered a simulation. So, like, I've dreamed before. That doesn't make me think dream skepticism is plausible, even though those dreams have been pretty vivid. You're always able to tell either in the act, if you get good at lucid dreaming or something, or after the fact that, oh yeah, that even if I was confused in the dream, and I knew that this has happened to me before, where I'm dreaming and don't know that I'm dreaming, and then I wake up, I'm like, oh yeah, phew, that was a dream.
Yes.
If we get good at as long as we are still good at being able to tell when we've entered a simulation or when we've exited a simulation, even if occasionally we get confused mid-simulation, I don't think that should raise our credence that we're in the matrix, so to speak.
Okay, I guess I'm thinking of a very specific kind of near perfect simulation of our reality. And I'm thinking that will one day become possible. So maybe not, though. Maybe it won't ever get that sophisticated. But imagine it does. And so it doesn't resemble dreams, where for most of us, we don't have like dreams that replicate in 100% detail our waking lives. When we wake up, we can see the clear distinction between the two. But what if we get to a point where the simulation we enter is perfectly on a par with what we take to be non-simulated experience? What should we infer then?
Yeah, I mean, if it gets to the point where you can't tell whether or not you're in a simulation, then I think we're probably in trouble.
Got it. Okay. All right. So, but this is really largely academic because I end up rejecting the simulation hypothesis really on strong grounds of saying it doesn't even possibly explain
Right.
fine-tuning for life. And here what I say is that if you look at the way that David Chalmers and others argue about the simulation and reason about what kind of properties we can expect simulations to have, those very considerations will seem to entail that the non-simulated world, whatever it is, the universe upstairs next door that simulates our universe, that will also be one that's literally fine-tuned for life in the same way that our laws of physics are fine-tuned. And so, for example, what David Chalmers says is we can think about simulation theology. We can reason from general considerations about what a simulator of our universe would be like, based on very general sorts of considerations. He says, if we reflect upon the likely history of our own simulations, we can then infer backwards to a likely candidate if our universe is a simulation. And so he says that in the long run, it's probably the case that most of our simulations will be run by AI systems because that'll be more efficient and blah, 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 blah. And therefore, it's likely that if our universe is simulated, it's probably from an AI system. Well, it seemed to me, thinking about that kind of logic about inferring from features of our simulations backwards, most of our simulations that feature complexity and life within them, if we ever get to that point, will almost certainly feature our laws of physics. The first reason being that we know our laws of physics work to generate complexity. Here we are. So it's always going to be simpler to replicate the machinery we know works than to create something from the ground up. And secondly, this was Luke Barnes' point, we don't even know that there are alternative mathematical structures that permit this much complexity as our physical laws. He says that every other set of mathematical structures, of physical laws that we've explored, either permits no complexity or structure at all, or it requires fine-tuning of a different kind. And therefore, given those two facts, it's likely that most of our simulations that feature complexity in life, those will have our same laws of physics and therefore be fine-tuned. But through the same logic of this like backward propagation or backward inference, we can say it's likely that our non-simulated universe that has simulated us also has our laws of physics and is therefore also fine-tuned for life. And therefore, we've just kicked the problem upstairs. So that's my mic drop moment. Daniel, take it away.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think probably if we're being simulated either because the simulators want to go back and like explore alternate paths to their history. Think of all like when we simulate stuff on our computers. A lot of it is just alternative history, and a lot of the rest of it is escapism. So if anything, I would expect their laws of physics to be a bit more boring than ours. I don't know what their equivalent of like magic or the force is, but we probably have it, which means that their place has got to be really dull.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. Maybe, of all people, Joe Rogan once said that quantum mechanics was good evidence that we're in a simulation. I don't know if that's the exact point you're making, but it's similar.
I mean, yeah, that might be it. That like it's going to be those kinds of weird, this is really janky and doesn't quite work, and yet somehow it does. Like that would be the thing. That would be the kind of thing to go looking for if we're somebody's escapist fantasy, and then you can wonder about the kind of person for whom that's escapism.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, good. I'm glad we're on the same page there. Did you have any other specific or global comments about the simulation hypothesis?
Not really. Like I thought that was like I thought your basic point was right. I did want to say, I thought the testability discussion was a little bit weird. Like, yes, theism is testable for one thing. It's pretty strong, or it decently strongly predicts that there's stuff. And hey, look. So like testable is as testable does. Could I conduct like a laboratory experiment for theism? Probably not. Like, is theism a hypothesis that makes some predictions about the world that we can look around and see it does? And like, they're fairly general. They're not super unique to theism. It's hard to make highly specific theistic predictions. You need to get
Mm.
into highly specific theistic religions. And then those do make highly specific predictions. So I wasn't really sure what was going on exactly with theism being testable or not. Like, you
Mm.
couldn't perform an experiment that would refute theism, I wouldn't think. I don't know. Maybe if we're allowed to shoot all of our nukes at each other or something. There, like Robin Collins suggested at some points that maybe God would step in and stop that. But like, I don't think we want to run that experiment. So short of that, yeah, we're not going to be able to confirm theism in an experiment the way we could run like a double slit experiment to
Right.
figure out the behavior of electrons and things like that. But
Yeah, I think
not testable is too strong, I think.
Okay. I can temper the point because I see what you're saying, but I think I know what Mizrahi would say, which is that his point is that the simulation hypothesis, is very concretely testable. It makes specific, empirically verifiable predictions that we can potentially verify in a laboratory. So the quality of the predictions is superior, and that points to its preferable, that we should have a preference for it over theism.
There will certainly be versions of simulation that predict like that the world is quantized. Again, there are going to be versions of theism that predict really specific things too. Like, if I say this prayer about this thing at this time. So, but like, does disconfirming that disconfirm theism? No, because it's a really, really specific version of theism that gets confirmed or disconfirmed. Like the hypothesis of theism plus God wants to do this specifically if I pray for it.
That's a good point.
And so, like, that can cut the other way too. Yeah, there's a family of simulation hypotheses that'll say that the world is quantized. Like, even more specifically, they'll tell you exactly at what, how big the quanta are. But then maybe Chalmers's thing, so maybe not all simulation hypotheses. And then again, you deal with big families of hypotheses like these. You're almost always able to sharpen them into something that's, quote, testable. And in fact, if you are clever, you can sharpen them into ones where you know that when you do the test, you'll be successful.
Yes.
But that doesn't tell you much because all you're confirming is a prediction from a hyper-specific thing that's going to lose a ton of probability on the prior.
Okay. Yes, I agree with you. I'm going to have to go through, I mean, as I do when I edit anyway, I'm going to go through and listen to this conversation again and make the corresponding edits to my paper because this is very helpful. All right, well, that carries us then to a consideration of the mouthful teleological cosmopsychism. This is Philip Goff's articulated explanation for fine-tuning, which is that the universe itself is a conscious agent. And critically, he claims that it's plausible that the values of the physical constants, those features that we appeal to as finely tuned, they had indeterminate values in the very first split second of the universe's origin. And it was during this time that the universe as a conscious agent fine-tuned those features to allow for life. And as for why, here he appeals to the objective value of conscious life, just like theists do when trying to show why a perfectly good God would create life. Well, it's good. And so the universe is aware of objective value facts and about the consequences of its actions in fine-tuning physics, and therefore it fine-tunes the universe for life because that's a good outcome. And so that's the hypothesis. It's very exotic, but that's what he says. And what's the most interesting claim that Goff makes is he thinks he can show that this hypothesis is better than theism. He'll grant, I think, that both explain fine-tuning equally well, both predict fine-tuning to the same degree, but nevertheless, other factors make it the case that cosmopsychism is more likely or plausible than theism. And here he basically makes 2 points. He says that evil and suffering are better accommodated or predicted by his hypothesis than by theism, and that cosmopsychism is a simpler and therefore more intrinsically likely explanation than theism. Okay, so that was the setup. How are we doing there, Daniel?
Yeah, I agree that that's Goff's view.
Okay, so then that leads us to a consideration of his first argument, evil and suffering. Here he argues for a unique approach to the problem of evil. He says that we plausibly have a cosmic sin intuition. Just by thinking about the universe and the evil and suffering on planet Earth, we can intuitively see that it would be immoral for any all-powerful being to create a universe like this. And he appeals to various thought experiments, some famous in the history of philosophy, like the utilitarian doctor who kills one patient to save five. His point is that even if this doctor brings about a greater good, saving five patients, nevertheless, he's still acting immorally because he's violating the rights of the first patient. And so then the analogy with theism is, even if we could show, which we can't, that all of the evil and suffering in the world is necessary for some greater good, nevertheless, God violates our rights by subjecting us to that suffering as a means to an end. And so it would be immoral for any all-powerful being to create a universe like this. That's his argument. I have a two-tiered objection. The first is I raise some doubts about whether we really have a cosmic sin intuition. But I think my strongest point is that evil is also evidence against cosmopsychism, because Goff's main point is that the universe acts based on value considerations. It's trying to maximize or actualize as much value as it can, good states of affairs within the universe. Now, if that's all you say, you're going to have a serious evidential problem based on all the disvalue in the universe, all the evil, all the suffering. And so it seems to me that sword just cuts both ways. And here I make the nice rhetorical point. Like, isn't a world... that's right. I'm getting ahead of myself. He does qualify the powers of the cosmic agent. He says it's limited by the laws of physics. The universe can only do things that are allowable by our laws of physics. So no miracles, which theism isn't restricted by that. But my point is just that there's plenty of evil in the world that you could prevent without violating the laws of physics. Like, isn't a world where the Holocaust didn't happen, isn't that allowable by physics? Isn't that physically possible? And here it would seem that obviously yes. Like, if I prevent, say I see my friend on the edge of a cliff and someone's running up to him trying to push him off, I can intervene and stop him from pushing my friend off the cliff. But I didn't violate the laws of physics in doing that. So why shouldn't it have been the case for every other instance of violence in the world that we see? The cosmic agent could have intervened. So that's my basic point. Why don't we stop there and we discuss? Daniel, did you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, this is basically the dialectic with John Stuart Mill on evil. Mill, I think, was the first major contemporary figure to propose that you solve the problem of evil by being theists but limit the power of your God. He's really well-intentioned. He's doing his best out there, okay? And Goff's view reminds me of that. Like, yeah, okay, we got this cosmic agent. It has some pretty impressive powers. It can fine-tune laws of physics. It somehow can't rescue cats up trees. It's doing its best, okay? Give it a break.
Yes.
And there's a couple of things to say. First of all, I didn't think Goff's discussion of, like, the cosmic sin intuition and whatnot interacted nearly enough with all of the literature on the problem of evil, which is not all utilitarianism, God's just allowing all of this for the greater. Like, there's been a big, long conversation about whether or not that's an adequate framework for thinking about evil in the case of standard theism. And Goff didn't seem to acknowledge that at all. So then you get into this, okay, we solve evil with a limited God, and the answer is you're describing a very odd sort of God-ish being that seems like anything. I think this is the point you make too. It seems like anything you're going to gain explaining evil that way, you're just going to bleed away on your prior, because now you've got to have, like, my powerful agent that can tune the laws of physics, but it can't pull cats out of trees. All right, that's a really specific power pack for somebody to have.
Yes. You
do avoid this particular evidential problem. You've raised explanatory issues of your own, because setting aside discussions of what's probable or not, something that can do anything, okay, that you need an explanation for why there would be a super powerful agent, but that's the only thing you need to explain. Something that's really powerful in this respect, but kind of weak in that respect, that seems like you're going to bring up additional explanatory questions that would be fuel for further arguments against your position that could then, like, bleed away your posterior when you put those into the background.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that point you made about shifting improbability to the priors, I think that's an important one. And an illustration I give is one from Hildebrand, which is that if you imagine flipping a coin 10 times, you'll come up with a specific sequence of heads and tails. We'll call it S. Now, the probability of S specifically coming up by chance is low. It's 0.1%. And so you might think, well, that's so low. Given that improbability, the sheer improbability of it happening by chance, do you now have grounds for thinking that a demon, for instance, influenced the outcome to bring about S? Well, no, because the general hypothesis, there is a demon that meddled with the coin toss, that doesn't do anything to predict S any more likely than appeal to random chance. You would still just you would provide a uniform probability distribution over all possible outcomes, and it seems they're all equally likely given the demon hypothesis. And so S by itself gives you no reason to think that there are demons at work. And then you might say, well, no, but I have a more specific demon hypothesis in mind. I have the S preferring demons in mind, demons that prefer sequences like S. And there it is the case that hypothesis makes it wildly more likely that you would observe S than appeal to chance. The problem is now you've just shifted the relevant improbability to the very probability of the S-specific demon hypothesis itself. It's really, I think, going to be numerically the same. And so that is an illustration of this kind of shifting of improbability to your priors that happens when you make added stipulations that have no independent evidence in their favor. That's the kind of idea.
Yeah, and no, particular, if it's one thing if my demon hypothesis, I could then show that, look, here's what demons are, and they actually do tend to prefer S-like sequences, then I've actually, helped myself because I've shown that the preference for S-like sequences itself is predictable conditional on there being a demon.
Yes.
So, if the sequence spelled out something like Hail Satan,
yes,
then the demon hypothesis is doing pretty well because, okay, yeah, it is actually more likely, potentially at least, that, a demon rigged my machine to make it say Hail Satan. This point gets made in the literature all the time about the stars spelling out the first verse of John in Koine Greek or what have you, if that would be fine-tuning enough for certain kinds of fine-tuning skeptics. Yes. And the general point still holds. You can find hypotheses that would have decent priors even when you are stapling a desire onto a being, if the being is the kind of being that you would expect to have that kind of desire. Yes. But that's not what's going on here. And at least Goff needs to say more to say why that would be what's going on in his case.
Yes, that's excellent. What did you think of my short critique of the cosmic sin intuition? I mean, I don't know. I don't really know what to make of it. It's a very bold claim to say that we can just see that God doesn't exist when we look at the evil in the world. It feels way too quick, but I don't really know how to cash that out in a rigorous way. So I'm wondering what you think.
I mean, it's hard to cash out in a rigorous way because the observation itself is not very rigorous.
Damn,
other people also say that they can just see that God exists when they look at the Milky Way. I can see neither of these things, so I don't really know how to address somebody who claims that they can just see this or that big cosmological metaphysical theory on the basis of their fairly limited life experience. I love that for you. At this point, they're just giving autobiography. It's not an argument.
Yes. Okay. Well, okay. In fairness, he does give a few thought experiments, one of which being the utilitarian doctor.
But there's two obvious problems. So the first obvious problem is that it's not clear that utilitarianism is false. If you stipulate sufficiently to the case that the consequences of saving the 5 are better than the consequences of dismantling the 1, which is not necessarily going to be true for your average emergency room, because if people suddenly realize that they could just be taken apart by going to the emergency room, you're going to get all sorts of public health disasters that the extra 4 lives are going to be a drop in the bucket. But look, we're philosophers. We know how to stipulate things away. Once you stipulate the consequences are better, then you're no longer giving a helpful thought experiment. You're just saying, well, here's a case where consequentialism says one thing, but I intuit the opposite. But it's so artificial that it's not helpful anymore.
Right. Okay.
The other point to make, especially if you're kind of going big in on the right sort of thing, it's relatively clear that I have rights against doctors because they're humans and I'm humans and we're in a society together. Yes. Not at all clear that I have rights against gods who are not humans, are in fact significantly better than humans. This is going to be controversial in some circles, but I don't really think that viruses have rights against me. Even though They might have rights against other viruses. I don't know if viruses have societies or not, but if panpsychists are right, maybe they do.
Mm.
And yet, the metaphysical gap between me and a virus is much smaller than between God and I.
Mm. Yeah, I that's interesting. I mean,
This is a Marilyn Adams point.
Okay. I wonder because there is a strong intuition that, you know, God merely being our creator doesn't give him wanton authority to do whatever he pleases with us. That there's still a sense in which God couldn't just do anything he wanted to us merely because he's created us. And yeah, you could appeal to the superior moral value of the being, but I wonder if that might be question begging. Because the atheist is going to say, right, they're perfectly good, and therefore they would never do all these things to us. I don't know that ontological disparity gets what you need. I mean, I'd have to think about it. This is off the top of my head. But do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question about what you want to say about perfect goodness. The traditional explication of perfect goodness was not in terms of, like, being perfectly moral, because the debates about how morality worked were very different 1,500 years ago. Right. It was more in terms of being, like, of the most excellent quality. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is that the claim is not that based on the fact that God created us, God can do whatever God wants. The claim is, like, I didn't create any of the viruses that I squish all the time. The claim is just that given the disparity in quality of being, even if we have claims against each other or against our near peers, maybe we'd also have claims against the Vulcans, we wouldn't have claims against something that much higher on the chain of being. Now it takes some work to spell that out. You have to be thinking about rights and obligations in a particular sort of, like, non-Kantian way.
Yes.
But, like, flipping over to meta-ethics, they're not super implausible ways of thinking. Like, Mark Murphy goes through and works through all the major, many of the major foundations of rights or foundations for why you should take other people's interests into account, and argues they wouldn't apply to an Anselmian being. This is in God's Own Ethics. So this is a live debate. It's
interesting,
not a settled debate in one direction or the other. So I don't want to make the further claim that Goff is definitely wrong.
Right.
But it's definitely not something that you just get to intuit.
Right. Okay, I need to take a cognizance of Murphy's work. I think that would be very pertinent here. So thank you for alerting me to that.
Yeah, that book is great.
Okay.
I criticized it in print, and still I think it's fantastic.
Good. No, that's how it works, isn't it? Like, there's never going to be a paper you fully agree with. So that can't be the relevant standard.
Yeah, general rule of thought. If I go on to write something in critique of somebody's work, I think their work is pretty good. Because if I thought their work was bad, I would simply ignore it and think about good stuff.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Right. Okay. So what do you think of Goff's second point? He says that, and I'll just quote him here. That'll be easier. He says that theism, quote, incurs great qualitative cost insofar as it postulates an immaterial and necessary being in addition to the physical and contingent universe. It also commits to a radically disunified conception of reality, with the natural world entirely distinct from the supernatural God, and unity is itself an important theoretical virtue. And then, of course, by contrast, cosmopsychism says that there's just this one conscious universe. Nothing distinct from it, just this one thing. It's unified, it's simple. I say that this argument faces two serious problems. The first is that cosmopsychism, which we've already touched on, is a remarkably complex hypothesis. And so in addition to the kind of arbitrary power restrictions that we've talked about, you also have to stipulate that the universe has knowledge sufficient to understand value judgments, because it doesn't seem that Goff thinks that the universe is all-knowing. And so it has just enough knowledge to understand the consequences of its actions. The second thing that you have to just stipulate, there's no necessary connection to the other things that are said in the hypothesis, is the existence of objective value. Goff thinks that it's simpler to think of the universe as geared towards objective value for various reasons. And even if you grant that, you still have to just postulate that there are these things of objective value facts, moral realism, but it provides no explanation for that. And the third is more technical, and it's a point about the non-uniform physics of the early universe. This is more of an experimental argument, so we'll see how it stands up. But my point here was just that for Goff's model to work, you have to maintain that the values of the constants of physics have not maintained their value throughout the history of the universe. Rather, he needs that very early initial stage where they have indeterminate values. That's how you get a moment in time where the universe can fix their values. If they go all the way back to the beginning, then the universe can nowhere intervene to make them life-permitting. They were always life-permitting. My point was to quote Sean Carroll's example in a slightly different context of general relativity on the one hand, and general relativity with the added stipulation that Newton's constant, which is in the general theory of relativity, will suddenly change sign in the year 2100. So in that year, it'll suddenly change to a different value. And Carroll's point is that we would reject that second theory as remarkably complex and unnecessarily so ad hoc, and therefore improbable for the simpler, more uniform theory. And my point was just that it seems parallel to what Goff is saying about the constant values in physics, that at the first split second of the universe, they had different values or had no values at all. That seems equally disunified as what Carroll is saying about the gravitational constant. So really, this is a rather abstract point. And it may be the case that it's not quite as bad, but I do still think there's an issue here. So, okay, enough from me. What do you think about those three further points of ad hoc complexity in Goff's hypothesis? Daniel?
Yeah, I am really suspicious. Anytime a philosopher comes along and tells me that the thing they're going to do is going to be simpler, and then they don't give me some precise criterion by which I can tell what the simpler thing is, then I feel like I'm just getting an explanation of their prior or something like that. I'm not getting an argument here. And that applies especially in this stuff about God. So like, this is something, we'll take Paul Draper as an example. Like Paul Draper comes out and says, I think uniformity is simpler.
Yes.
Now, he doesn't fess up that by uniformity, he means uniformity according to my preferred way of describing things. That's a big problem for him because, and this actually speaks to the Carroll point too, like depending on how you describe things are uniform relative to a description. If I shift around the predicates I'm using in the right way, I can always get a uniform description, which is why I think some of these syntactic things like, well, this has limits and this doesn't have limits. Well, it does when you put it that way, but now let me groupify myself some new predicates and I'll describe it a different way. And now the other one's the uniform one and this one's the limited one. And so there's a point here that like either we have to be really, really careful and find like contextual reasons for thinking that this is the preferred partition, to kind of use the probability theorist language. These are the right terms in which to be thinking locally for like contextual reasons, or we have to like go full Ted Sider and say, no, there's like a structural language in which to write the book of the world. And then we can start doing all of these syntactic moves that people like. We can count the symbols with the Kolmogorov people. We can look for universal generalizations with Draper. We can do some of these things, but until we admit and fess up to the fact that we've gone full Ted Sider, or we've given a really thorough explanation for why this is the right way to partition the problem in this particular local context. Like most of these things are just people, again, to me, they're just people giving their autobiography. They're not giving an argument. So that's one point to make about like simplicity discussion writ large.
Yes.
There's a smaller point to make here that Goff...
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a smaller point to make here that Goff doesn't actually need moral realism. He needs a really specific kind of moral realism. If moral realism is like Cornell realism, then he's in trouble. If moral realism is like theological voluntarism or some kind of agent voluntarism, then he's in trouble. And these are realist theories of morality. Don't let anyone tell you they're not. What he needs is something like moral Platonism or Morean non-naturalism, something like that is what he actually needs. And so even amongst the moral realisms, that's only some of them. And he's got to be paying some probabilistic price for that. I agree.
Can you expand on those different options for a moral realism? Some of those terms I'm not familiar with.
Yeah,
Like
so
Cornell
Cornell
realism.
realists think
What's
that
that?
think that you index the good to the flourishing of, like, usually they're thinking of humans, but you
Mm,
index good to some kind of biological flourishing. Uh,
mm.
and with, if there's no biology yet, unclear, unless the thing is like thinking through the different possible biologies and picks like human flourishing, but like why not Vulcan flourishing? Why not dolphin flourishing? Uh, so that's where Cornell realism is going to cause issues with him. Voluntarism, of course, you need, theological voluntarism, you need there to be a God in the picture, and then the God can pick whatever God wants as the good, at least in like the full bore Occam early Islamic
Yes.
voluntarisms. And those are the kind that I'm talking about here. Like they're the kinds where there are versions of voluntarism where it's just the right that gets stipulated, the good is given. But in ones where the good is given, which are the kinds that I think Goff can't have, even though they're types of moral realism, then he would need his universe to decide, it's good to have conscious agents and then have conscious agents.
Yes.
If he was going to have a theory like that. So the point is just that even if we grant him moral realism, which is a non-obvious thing to grant, although like fair enough in a lot of these contexts, it's a specific version or specific
Yes.
versions of moral realism that he needs.
Yes.
That might not even be the majority report among moral realists.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that warrants an expansion on the point that I made, so I appreciate that. I guess I would just say that, well, this will be what I have to say about your point about the relative nature of simplicity depending on the predicates we use and so on. That'll be more pertinent when I then go on to discuss the second point I make, which is not just that cosmopsychism is complex, but it does seem there are some grounds for saying that theism is remarkably simple. And
Right.
so the first thing I say is that in contrast to cosmopsychism, which has all these postulates, it certainly looks like theism requires less. And for one thing, theism makes it far more likely that there would be objective values, it seems to me. And there I articulate a fairly standard account of the relationship between God and morality, where it's God's character that is the paradigm of moral value. And if we think, and I make the point that we don't have to argue for this view or that theism entails this view, but just that if we think that this view it takes up a decent amount of space in the probability space under theism, then theism will make it decently likely that there is objective value. It'll provide an explanation for it in a way that cosmopsychism just doesn't at all. And then the second point I make is that, and this is one that other theistic philosophers have made, that God's unlimited attributes, having all power, all knowledge, being perfectly good, those are simple in a way that all of the limited versions of those properties, being able to do A and B but not C, knowing this but not that, having this degree of moral goodness but not past that point. The unlimited properties are much simpler than those limited versions. And here Richard Swinburne gives the example of comparing the stipulation that the laws of physics apply everywhere in the universe, and this is similar to Sean Carroll, versus the stipulation that the laws of physics apply everywhere except the Andromeda Galaxy. We would think intuitively that second version, given this arbitrary limitation, is far, far less likely just intrinsically than the first one. And then it's not too much distance to then say that the hypothesis of a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, all good, is far more intrinsically likely than all of those sub-theistic hypotheses or quasi-theistic hypotheses that attribute some limited degree of power, knowledge, or goodness to God. And then I have a little more complicated argument looking at Miller, 2016, but that's the basic point. Daniel, I'll let you reiterate some of the things you said, but let you comment explicitly on that, and then I'll give a response.
Yeah, so of course, one point to make is that this is going to be language dependent. Like if I redescribed if I groupify the power predicates appropriately, then like the God who can do everything but rescue a kitten up a tree is going to end up with a more uniform thing than the all-powerful one.
Yes.
And this is just like a really simple point about how you can always redescribe a situation. That being said, I do think you could have made the point stronger here by being more specific about what simplicity gain you're getting.
Okay.
And like setting aside the language issue, like let's say we have gone full Ted Sider.
Okay.
Usually there are three ways that people talk about simplicity or simplifying or parsimony. These all kind of get used interchangeably. You can talk about ontological parsimony, like getting fewer things or fewer types of things. You can talk about ideological parsimony, having like fewer concepts or fewer kinds of concepts. And once you've gone full Ted Sider, I think you have to take ideological parsimony pretty seriously. The third type, and I think this is the type that you're kind of ultimately appealing to, is something known as axiomatic simplicity, where you try to write down the simplest laws. And there's a reasonably good case that this is actually what's going on in simplicity in the sciences talk, is that usually simplicity gains are a kind of axiomatic simplicity, at which point, A, that's the kind of simplicity we probably should attune to more, because it looks like that's the one that's got a decent worldly track record. And then B, the point to be made is just that you not only get a simpler by going with all powerful, all knowing, etc. The specific kind of simpler you get is simpler axioms, because just like writing down the law that says God can do all the things except rescue kittens up trees is going to be longer than writing down God can do everything. And yes, like counting how much does it take to write it down seems like a kind of dumb metric, but it's surprisingly successful.
Right. Okay. I'll need to think more about the details of simplicity. I mean, I've read a bit, but I'm not familiar with that three-tier distinction. So after this, I'll ask you about where I can go digging further, like axiomatic simplicity specifically. I mean, I know what it means, but I've never heard it used in that context. So I think thinking more about that will prove helpful for me.
Yeah, I think that's good. I don't know if anyone has ever like sat down and done this as the taxonomy. This is more just me making an observation about how parsimony arguments, at least in metaphysics, work, and the three things that tend to come up. Okay,
good. Well, then I can still utilize it without having to do too much digging. But I like that. That's very helpful. Right. I guess I would just, the only comment I'd want to make about this linguistic problem is I've heard this before, and my gut reaction was always to go, yeah, but it seems that there's something like we can just tell the cases of the more natural predicate, even if we don't know the details as to why. It just seems clear like there's a way. And in other areas and domains of philosophy, like I feel like that's good enough for the time being. Like, yeah, we want to know how it is that we can show that one predicate is inherently more complex than another, but like we can just kind of see that one is gerrymandered in the way that the other is not. I don't know if you'll find that reply impressive, but that's always been my gut instinct, is just go, I mean, yeah, but.
So I wouldn't necessarily want to say gerrymandered and complex are the same, because there's probably a way to gerrymander things in ways that are going to look simple into clever.
Sure.
But my point is less about that being a bad way of proceeding. Like, I think it's really hard to escape going the full Ted Sider, but almost nobody admits that that's what they're doing, except Ted Sider. That's part of why writing the book of the world is so good. And I think we should just be honest that we're okay. I'm making an assumption that these are the objective joints in reality, and that theorizing in terms of them is the right way to proceed, even though I could produce equally true stuff if I theorized in terms of their gerrymanders. Like, that's part of the puzzle, is that like it's not like you talk in the GRU language, you don't say false stuff. That's the new riddle of induction. So why is it better to talk about green and blue? Why is it better to talk this way? And explaining that is super difficult. And like, as writing the book of the world brings out, it takes you all sorts of counterintuitive places. But the point, and this is like part of the big argument of writing the book of the world one, the point is like, what's your alternative? Because especially if you're playing the simplicity game and partition relativity is everywhere and basically ineliminable, like your other alternative is to like do paint by numbers, finding the right partition in every particular problem. And that's just gonna, like, the dream of objective Bayesianism was that we could find norms that went beyond probabilism and conditionalization that all rational agents had to respect. And as soon as you realize almost all of them are partition relative, it's like, okay, so we're kind of just doing subjectivism again. Or we have to like be the Ted Sider types, and then I think we can do it. But we have to be upfront that that's what we're doing, and a lot of people are not as upfront about that as they should be.
All right. Yeah, fair. Things get complicated quickly. But I think, all in all, that's a very good conversation about cosmopsychism. And aside from those very thorny philosophical problems, I think my basic points are right, but it'll be a matter of how much I want to and how much I can acknowledge the deeper philosophical issues, like you've raised.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I'm not necessarily saying you have to account for all of this in your paper specifically, because the literature works a certain way, and the points you're making are, I think, are good points within the way that literature works. I just have complaints about the literature.
No, and that's fair. And I think that and one of the points of this paper is calling out an assumption that's often taken for granted, which is just that we can talk about the binary between these very two specific hypotheses. So that's fair.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the next alternative explanation, which you may or may not have heard of, is called axiarchism. This, in general, is the view that a fact or state of affairs X obtains because it is good that X should obtain. And often this kind of framework is applied to existence itself as the ultimate explanation for why there's something rather than nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? Because it's good that there should be something. And I think Goff helpfully distinguishes between pure and impure axiarchist explanations. Impure axiarchism would be views that only maintain that axiological or value-based considerations are part of the explanation for something. And so you'll notice that theism is an impure axiarchic explanation. It says that God created life because life is good. But it's not a pure axiarchism because it's adding in other explanatory or causal factors, God and God's will. So in here we have pure axiarchism in mind. The idea in this case that cosmic fine-tuning results because it's good that the universe should be fine-tuned for life, and that's it. That's our full explanation. If you find that hard to understand, so do I. But I try to assess it as carefully as I can. And here's a quote from Leslie that'll help flesh things out. Leslie 2003 writes that some Platonic realities are realities of ethically required existence. Whether or not there was anything in existence or ever would be, the existence of various things could be ethically needful. An absence of all existence would be in a way tragic because there might have been a good situation instead. And a situation sufficiently good, one which wouldn't be rather a pithy because... No, I'm sorry, I messed that up. One which wouldn't be rather a pity because... Okay, I'm going to edit that out. And a situation sufficiently good could perhaps have an existence required not just ethically, but with creative effect. And then the idea is just that that's all there is to it. There's this ethical requirement that the universe geared towards the objective good of life exists, and that requirement is creatively effective. My very general point or objection is that that stipulation is explanatorily opaque. I don't know what it means to say that an ethical requirement is creatively effective. And here I make the objection a bit more precise by saying we can frame this in terms of a dilemma. Either axiarchism is positing a causal relationship between abstract and concrete objects, or it's not. Mulligan 2017 distinguishes between these two. He calls it substantive versus formal axiarchism. And my point with respect to substantive axiarchism is saying, okay, there are these abstract objects like goodness or ethical requiredness, properties. The abstract objects in general are like things like properties, attributes, numbers, abstract things. This would be the view that goodness itself, say, causally literally brings about the universe. There's a causal interaction of some kind or other between the abstract object and the concrete universe. And this abstract object causes the universe to be fine-tuned for life. And there the point would just be that many philosophers define the very distinction between abstract and concrete objects as objects that have no causal powers. They're causally impotent versus those that do. And so it seems that intuitively, thinking about abstract objects, they just don't seem like the right sort of things in the first place to have causal powers. And so on that basis, we should reject the first alternative of this dilemma, that there are that goodness itself is causally bringing about the universe. So let's stop there for a second. Daniel, any comments about axiarchism as a whole, how I framed it, or about this first specific version of it?
Yeah, so I agree. I think that's the view that tends to be called axiarchism. I had a question about impure versus pure. So the way you put it, the impure axiarchism is the view that goodness plus some other stuff brings about things. Like the reason we have things is because of goodness, but also some other stuff, like a divine will or something like that, as opposed to the pure view being the view that things come about because they're good.
Right.
If we have a view where like goodness is part of the contributing reason for why things are brought about, but there are other reasons in play. So like not other productive forces, but say you had a view that's like pure axiarchism and it thinks that goodness sort of directly explains stuff, but it doesn't fully explain stuff because there's, some other principle, say like the rule of cool, that's also in effect so that you get good things in the coolest possible way. Would that be an impure or a pure axiarchism?
Probably an impure axiarchism by this definition, but it would inherit the same problems as a substantive pure axiarchism. Maybe.
Yeah, so that was one just thought about the distinction. At first I didn't understand impure axiarchism because I thought it was that other thing I'd mentioned where there are multiple reasons explaining why stuff happens, some of which are goodness oriented and some of which are oriented to other stuff. Then I realized, you're not talking about the reasons in this. You're talking about the mechanisms where the impure versions are just goodness plus some other thing, maybe that contributes the actual oomph. Yes. And then I thought, well, maybe, so there are actually three views here. Goodness plus no extra oomph, goodness plus other reasons, but there's still no extra oomph, and then goodness plus something oomphy.
Okay, I like it. I like this 3-tiered classification. I'll incorporate that in. But yeah, that's good clarificatory point.
Yeah, so then on the first horn of the dilemma, like this is going to boil down to the question of how important you think juice is when it comes to causation.
Juice?
The dialectic that plays itself out over and over in like the literature on the cosmological argument, where you have some people saying there has to be a first cause because otherwise what explains the whole series. Like the analogy is sort of like causes pass causal juice onto their effects. And so you need a source of the juice in order to get the juice flowing in the first place. And so people who like causal powers will talk a lot about this. Like oomph is another one that kind of like, this is a critique of like David Lewis's theory of causation, is that it never explains where's the oomph. There's no oomph in Lewis's theory. Whereas like the Lewisians are going to say, causation, you don't need oomph. Causation is just a sophisticated pattern. It's the, counterfactual dependence plus whatever we've souped up to get around all the preemption stuff. Now you'd go to Woodward and you'd read about causal models and the manipulationist theories. Like that's going to be the latest incarnation of the Lewis program. So like, it seems to me that your first horn of the dilemma works really well for people who are already in the like oomph and powers and juice camp. Whereas somebody who's like mourning the loss of David Lewis's counterfactual account and trying to recover it as best they can isn't really going to move because they're going to say something like, the axiarchist is saying that this thing, like conscious life, the fine-tuning of the universe. So one point to make is that you could have gotten life from one source and the fine-tuning of the laws from goodness, or like the bare matter at the early Big Bang, that could have come from one thing, and then the laws being fine-tuned to shape it in certain ways, that could come from a different thing. If you think that like the existence of matter itself is neutral, so axiarchism doesn't predict or anti-predict it, but the existence of laws that permit life, like that's a good thing. So if you think that fact just has to counterfactually depend on the fact that it's good, if you're like that kind of Humean axiarchist, then your objection is not really going to hold much sway to them because they're going to be like, no, my whole theory of causation is it doesn't have to be that way. We don't need a mechanism. The counterfactual dependence is enough. That's how I read Leslie when I read Leslie as being like, at least as only committing to this. And you don't necessarily have to be a full-on Humean about laws of nature. Like you could do this same thing if you've got what's known as the constraining view of laws, which has gotten popular in the last couple of years. There you'd say something like, there's a natural law that just says, in addition to all of the other ways that trajectories can't go, they can't go in ways that aren't kind of good. And anything that lacked fine-tuned laws or that lacked conscious life, like forget about fine-tuned laws. Any trajectory that didn't give rise to conscious life, even the ones with fine-tuned laws that then somehow something else dumb happened and life never showed up.
Yes.
Those all get ruled out by the axiarchist law because it's a constraining law that won't let reality go that way. So my thought on that was just that, like, this depends a lot on what you think about laws and causation to work.
Yes. Now, okay, I agree with you, but it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that those considerations are pertinent when assessing formal axiarchism. Because formal axiarchism is the one that strikes me more as what you're saying about the laws of nature as Humean. And no. It would be more akin to saying about the laws of where here there's this axiarchic principle that's akin to a prescriptive or restrictive law of nature.
Yeah.
So okay. But insofar as we're focused on substantive axiarchism, do you think the general point about this direct causal interaction between an abstract object and the universe or whatever is a good point that I'm making?
Yeah, I mean, the abstract concrete distinction is kind of vexed. Like, there's that discussion in Plurality where David Lewis is like, people say it's bad that my worlds are concrete and it would be good if they were abstract. I don't really know what they mean by that. Here are 4 different ways of doing the distinction, all of which are kind of problematic. I'm going to say they're concrete because that seems right, but I'm also not going to be so bothered by it. So I wouldn't have hung my hat so much on that. But just think in general, like, how often do principles and laws cause stuff?
Yes.
Answer, not that often.
Okay.
And so the impure axiarch is somebody who's already committed to saying that, like, causation works in the following way with, like, juice and oomph and what, pick all the analogies you want. If you're already committed to saying something like that, and so, like, if the impure axiarchist view just is that the reasoning comes from goodness, but the mechanism comes from something else, well, then you've got to say what the else is going to be. The else can't just be a principle, because generally speaking, principles don't do that.
Right.
Then you don't have to, like, go through principles are abstract and abstracted don't do. You can just go directly, like, principles don't stand in this relation. Go outside and start counting causal relations, and you won't find principles in them very often, if at all.
Right. Okay, that's a good point, which I grant you, and I think that would sharpen my critique. So then what do we say in the formal axiarchic case? This is the claim, and I quote Mulligan here, "The universe is actual because it is good that it be actual, and moreover, nothing causes this to happen." So here what I say is to compare it again to impure axiarchism. So we have this assertion that the universe exists because it is good that it should. And we see that theists affirm this claim as well. It's just that they add an explanatory layer. They say that God creates the universe to be fine-tuned for life because it's good that life should arise and God is perfectly good. And so it's like, I look at that and I can see what it means at least. But if you delete that further explanatory layer and we're just left with the universe exists because it's good that it should be and nothing causes it to be the case, well, then I really struggle to understand what this view is even asserting. It's not clear what it even means. Now, Mulligan goes on to give the example of the laws of logic as a kind of illustration of the kind of causal production or the kind of explanation we're talking about here. We can imagine impossible descriptions of reality or possible worlds, ways reality could have been. In this case, it's impossible. So like a world where 2 + 2 = 5. What prevents a description of that world from being real? What prevents a world from being actual? Well, the laws of logic. But they don't cause the world to be a certain way in the way that we mean that I cause a cup to rise when I pick it up. It's rather that they play some sort of restrictive role on what can happen. And so he uses that as an illustration of what the axiarchist is proposing. Ethical requirements have the same sort of some kind of effect or restriction on the world without being a directly causal one. But then the point I make is that, like, logical consistency only shows what is only pertinent to what can exist if something exists, right? It doesn't explain the origin of things that exist. It doesn't explain how things come into being. It's just saying that if there is something, then it must be logically consistent. And so what makes axiarchic principles so difficult to understand is that they bring things into being, but in a non-causal sort of way. So that's...
Well, they explain why there are things. Like the axiarchist isn't committed to there being a beginning of the universe, so the axiarchist isn't committed to there being any bring into existence. They are committed to their principles serving as like partial grounds of the fact that the universe exists.
Okay.
And that, I mean, it's definitely like once you're doing that, we're going to start replaying dialectics from the cosmological argument, I suspect.
Well, I mean, isn't the point the axiarchic makes is that the universe exists because it's good that it should? It is an explanation for the existence of the universe?
There is an explanation for why it exists, but it's not the kind of explanation that the metaphysics in most cosmological arguments are going to require, because the cosmological arguments in their like specific forms are not just like, I just need something that I can tag with explanation. There are rules about what a good explanation is. And like one of the rules is that it has this kind of productive causal power type of thing, or something analogous.
Yes.
And the axiarchic principle doesn't have that, because the axiarchist of this sort is working within a completely different explanatory paradigm.
Yes.
So then the question will just be, okay, is this way of giving explanations good or not? If it is, then the axiarchist is fine. If it's not, like that form of axiarchism doesn't work, not for reasons particular to axiarchism, but just because like this whole way of explaining things that they're trying to utilize doesn't work either.
Yes.
So like as a thing of its kind, I think pure axiarchism is perfectly intelligible. Whether it beats theism, now we're going to have to start like, you're going to have just as bad a problem with evil on pure axiarchism as you're going to have on theism. Maybe a worse problem with evil, because at least on theism, you can appeal to mixed divine motives. Like God wanted things to be good, but maybe God wanted other stuff too. Whereas pure axiarchism, you've either got to be like super pessimistic about the possibilities for goodness, or you've got to say that we're in some kind of cosmic aberration moment, given how many bad things there are.
Yes. So, okay, but would you agree with my limited point that the laws of logic are not analogous to the needed axiarchic type explanation? Because the laws of logic don't explain why anything exists. It just supplies necessary conditions rather than sufficient conditions. It's just saying that in order for something to exist, it's got to be logically consistent. But it doesn't explain why anything exists.
I think Alex Proust loves making the point that the laws of logic do actually entail that something exists.
What would that be?
Something. Like literally, it's going to be a theorem that there is an x such that x equals x, because the class of models doesn't have one with an empty domain.
All right. Well, that's interesting. I guess I'll have to acknowledge that.
I mean, most people don't take that as an argument for the existence of God or anything like that, but like you do actually have to go to free logic if you want a logic that doesn't entail that something exists.
Okay. No, good point. I'll have to think about that. So then, I think my point here for preferring theism to axiarchism is, I don't know if you read this version where I try to model explanatory depth, and it's just about how it emerges naturally from Bayes' theorem, and the relevant question will be like, which is more likely, that God exists or that there are these creatively effective axiarchic principles? And there I kind of just repeat some of the considerations I laid out in prior hypotheses that seem to suggest theism is a simpler and therefore more likely hypothesis, and those same points won't translate to axiarchic type explanations.
Yeah, I thought that suggestion about explanatory depth was cool. I didn't have enough time to like properly think through it. I suspect that like if there's something there, there's a whole paper there, because
right.
Like the idea of deep versus shallow explanations is one that comes up naturally enough, and I'm not aware of anybody who's given a good technical explication. So if someone could, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
I
Hopefully.
thought what you said in the paper was enough to suggest that there's something interesting. It wasn't enough to prove that you were right, type of deal. But
Sure.
I wouldn't have expected that, like embedded in some subsection in a paper on something else.
Yeah.
My thought on that was that's an interesting idea. It's an initial kind of striking first explanation you gave. That's something to think more about.
Okay. I'll take it. And then, I think there was just the other point that formal axiarchism, that's what we're going with, it proposes this utterly unique kind of explanation, creatively effective axiological laws. And this is similar to what you were saying. Like, we know of nothing else like it. And for many of us, the very claim is that something exists solely because it's good. It's difficult to even understand, much less to affirm. But at least, like, theism proposes a relevantly familiar kind of explanation, a personal explanation. This thing happened because someone brought it about. And that, at the very least, we can understand what that means. And that's got to count somehow in favor of theism and against axiarchism, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I feel like you've got to balance that with the point that theism's got a really weird kind of being, like utterly unique and qualifying religious experiences, pretty much alien to at least everyday experience type of being. So this is going to strikes me as one where you're going to end up picking your poison. Like, you've got a super weird being that does stuff in a kind of normal way, or you've got a relatively anodyne being, like it's just a principle or a natural law that explains stuff in a really weird way. There's going to be some kind of weirdness on both sides. Which of those is a bad weirdness, I'm not sure.
Right. Okay. That's fair enough. Okay. Any other final comments on axiarchism, Daniel?
It's worth noting, I think Noah McKay has made this point in some online discussions a couple of times. There's at least a decent case to be made that axiarchism might end up entailing theism, because among the good things that there could be, it's a perfect being, seems pretty good. I don't know as it's totally knocked down. I haven't thought it through completely thoroughly, but it might end up being that, like, while it is good to have a perfect being, there could be other kind of goods that perfect being excludes, like maybe certain kinds of cooperation that can't happen when you've got a perfect being on the scene. It's at least worth thinking about, like, what goods would be in competition with a perfect being, so that maybe the axiarchic principle ends up favoring those instead. So I don't think it's a straightforward entailment. But definitely a decent chunk of the axiarchism probability space is going to end up being theism probability space too.
Yes. Yeah, that is a point that Robin Collins has made, that axiarchism will end up entailing theism, so it's not really an alternative. But I think to get there, you're going to have to wade through, like everything else, some substantive philosophical discussion about anti-theism, of like, that discussion about would the world be better or worse if God existed. And that's apparently controversial, where they're making exactly the points you do, that, like, if God exists, there are certain goods that are no longer possible. Now, they strike me as, like, utterly outweighed by the goods that come from God existing, but that's a whole different conversation. I did have a footnote where I at least mentioned that point.
Yeah. My impression of the protheism versus anti-theism is like the Globetrotters versus the Generals.
Yeah.
But there are some fans on the other side, so it's, at least I wouldn't go for entailment.
Right.
I would say, like, predicts or strongly probabilifies.
Yes.
So then that slice of non-theistic axiarchism, that we would need work to develop it in order to, like, count axiarchism as a successful rival. I think it's a rival worth thinking about, because a lot of things that theism aims to explain, it aims to explain by saying, well, these are good and God wants good stuff. And so then axiarchism is like, wait, why don't we just cut out the middleman?
Right.
And so I think it is important to think about that. And I wouldn't be shocked if there were ways of developing atheistic axiarchism that just haven't been thought of, because nobody has thought that carefully about axiarchism yet, except, like, John Leslie.
Right. Well, I'm hoping John Leslie appreciates the interaction I'm giving to the view. And I don't see any of my discussion as knockdown refutations. I just hope, as with anything, that it forwards the dialectic. It advances the conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
So, the final alternative, natural teleology. Were you able to see my comments on this? Because I think in the very first draft I gave you, I didn't really have anything there.
That's the Nagel.
Yes.
I have to admit, it's a little hard for me to see daylight between that and pure axiarchism.
Well, after our comments, so far I agree, but we'll go forward and see what we can do. So the quote from Thomas Nagel goes where he says that the laws of nature are teleological in the sense that they bias the universe towards life, consciousness, reason, and value. Speaking about the evolution of biological organisms, Nagel contends that, quote, teleology is a naturalistic alternative that is distinct from all three of the other candidate explanations, chance, creationism, and directionless physical law, adding that such a view, quote, means that in addition to physical law of the familiar kind, there are other laws of nature that are biased towards the marvelous. Paul Davies is one of the few people to really consider this view, and he says that, quote, in this theory, the biofriendliness of the universe arises from an overarching law or principle that constrains the universe multiverse to evolve towards life and mind. So if you apply that general framework to fine-tuning, we could say, along with cosmopsychism, there was a period in the very early history of the universe where the values of the constants were indeterminate, and then these teleological laws that aim towards a certain end, in this case the valuable end of life, kick into place and steer the values of the constants towards life-permitting values. Now, as I say the view, and talk about it now, especially after talking with you, Daniel, this looks a lot like axiarchism, doesn't it?
Yeah. Like, you could make it not axiarchism by saying something like, look, the axiarchists think there's a principle that bends the universe towards good. I think there's a principle that bends the universe towards agency, not because agency is good, but with agency as like an end in itself. And then you would technically have daylight. Like, you'd have the same theism problem because, like, hey, a perfect agent, that, like, what's more agency than God? It's unclear. So maybe you're going to be able to come up with things in the mode of axiarchism that take the stuff other than good as an end that still end up predicting biological life and other stuff like that.
Okay.
They will have prior problems, I think, because it's like at least somewhat intuitive that good be an end in itself. It's not at all intuitive that like lizards be an end in themselves. So that'll be one thing to worry about in the Nagelish stuff. They're going to inherit all of your objections to the mode of explanation that you get in pure axiarchism, because they're going to also, like, they're going to be, it works just like this view. All that changes is the end.
I'm going to have to think more about this because, I don't want the conversation about natural teleology to be just redundant to the axiarchism discussion. I guess I thought of axiarchism as positing a metaphysical principle that applies necessarily to all possible worlds. It's saying that it's just a metaphysical fact that the goodness of reality is the reason that it obtains, or something along those lines. But that it's a metaphysical principle. And here Nagel specifically is saying that no. The laws of nature, what scientists reason about, some of those are in themselves teleologically oriented. They're oriented towards future states. And that struck me as a different thesis. But maybe it's just a variation by degree rather than a totally different kind of hypothesis.
Yeah, I think it's technically different, but like the difference between a physical law and a metaphysical law is just which possibilities we're willing to exclude in this particular conversation. There's not a deep difference. At least I don't think.
Okay, well, that will make me reflect on how to frame the discussion in that case. What I do to assess this view is I just try to map on I draw out three different interpretations of this proposal based upon the different camps in philosophy of science about how to understand what laws of nature are. So broadly speaking, there's the Humean and the non-Humean views about what laws of nature are. The Humean view is that laws of nature are just descriptions of the regularities that obtain in the world. They don't in and of themselves govern or restrict what can happen, whereas non-Humean views say that this can happen, that this is what laws of nature do. And within the non-Humean camp, you have primitivist theories, which say that laws of nature do govern and constrain, and laws of nature themselves do it, and they are just primitive elements in our ontology. There's no deeper way to break down what they are. They're just there, and they directly govern what happens in the world. And then you might instead give a dispositional analysis of laws of nature where, again, there's a sense in which laws of nature are descriptive, but they describe the capacities and dispositions of the actual stuff in the universe. That's where the laws arise from. It's the causal powers and capacities of things in the universe. And so then...
Yeah, I would have actually shifted the dispositional view into the Humean camp. It's
Really?
a kind of Humeanism. It's not Lewis's Humeanism where everything's categorical, but like the law itself is only a summary in both cases.
Well,
you're summarizing different things, but the laws are not oomphy in the dispositionalist view. The dispositions are the oomphy things.
Right. I see what you're saying. That being said, this doesn't mean you're wrong, but I think in the standard way of characterizing it, in the two like Cambridge Elements series I looked at, the dispositional view is listed as a type of non-Humeanism.
It is. It almost always is, and they always kind of define themselves against Humeans, but I think they're just not facing up to the fact that they too think laws are summaries. Their disagreement with the Humean is not about the nature of law, it's about the nature of stuff, which they think has all of these dispositions, and that the Humean thinks is all categorical.
Okay, good. I think you're right, which I actually just now accidentally stumbled upon when I referred to them as descriptive. So, okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. So what I say in the Humean case, the conventional way, is that if that's all you're saying, that the teleological laws of nature are just descriptions of what happens in the universe, that it just is the case that it seemed to me that was just the very claim of fine-tuning repackaged. It's just saying the universe is fine-tuned for life. Unless you're sliding into one of these other views, like dispositionalism, saying the universe has this inbuilt capacity that to develop and unfold towards life. It seemed to me that a purely descriptive claim that the universe tends towards life in mind, it doesn't explain anything. So that would be the first point I make. What did you take of that?
Well, so it explains, but it explains by unifying. This is the old fight between Humeans and non-Humeans. Are Humean laws of nature explanatory? Yes, they are, but they're not explanatory in the way that like DTA laws or like Maudlin style simple laws are, because they themselves don't do any of the pushing and pulling. They explain by unifying disparate phenomena. So this gets into fights about what you think the job of a law of nature was in the first place.
I guess it's just not even clear to me what a Humean teleological law would be in this case. It's just saying that, as a matter of fact, the values of the constants aimed towards life. But then I really...
the Humean, well, so the form of the Humean law will be exactly the same as the form of the non-Humean law. What'll be important is the metaphysical import of that.
Yes.
The Humean law... So, like, how do we write down a Humean law like that? It'll just be a law that says something like the universe tends toward agency or what have you. Why is it a law? Because it ended up as an axiom of the best system from which we could deduce everything else, the same way any other thing ends up as a Humean law.
I see.
So the difference won't be in the content of the law. The difference will be in what kinds of explanation we wish to employ our laws. Because the Humean law will explain by unifying our data. That's what Humean laws do. They unify. Right. Whereas the primitivist law will explain because it's part of the productive forces that produce the next moment, like in Maudlin's, in a Maudlin style case, or in a constraining law case, it will explain by ruling certain paths out of bounds.
Yes.
That's how constraining laws explain. So the difference in these theories is not in the content of the laws. It's all the same equations and whatnot.
Right.
It's in what type of explanation they're suited to do. And then the meta fight about which is the right theory of laws, it is going to depend on what kind of explanations you were hoping your laws were going to provide for you in the first place.
So then I wonder in a Humean case, if instead we could make the objection that a teleological law doesn't seem to have broad enough unification to inherit the same kind of explanatory advantage that we might give to other laws of nature that seem to apply broadly into multiple disparate phenomena, whereas here we just have this very specific law about the fine-tuning of the constants. So that doesn't strike me as relevantly the same as force equals mass times acceleration, which applies all over the place to everything all the time.
I agree that that's going to be a big worry.
Okay.
You need to be buying enough fit to explain the complication of the axiom system that this law is going to give you.
Yes.
And I agree that it's not very clear that the universe is sufficiently oriented towards this or that for a teleological law to make sense in the Humean setting.
Okay. Good. All right. That's a better critique to offer then. So then in the case of primitive teleology, this is where we should think that natural laws in and of themselves do govern and constrain the world, but we can't further analyze them. They're just primitive features of our ontology. And one author, Chen, contends that the laws of logic and axioms of mathematics illuminate kind of the proposed governing relation between laws and the natural world. Here he says, truths like these, quote, can also be said to constrain our world. That is, the actual world cannot be a world that violates those mathematical or logical truths.
Yep.
In fact, every possible world needs to respect those truths. In a similar way, laws of physics constrain our world. So it's like, all right, good. I kind of get what that's saying, that teleological laws rule out those possibilities that don't unfold towards the relevant end in this case. And here I make more precise an objection that Philip Goff raises, which is that, quote, presumably the teleological laws could have pointed to anything. We might have found ourselves in a universe directed towards non-life, or towards ceaseless suffering, or towards something totally pointless, like having all the matter in the universe arranged in a polka-dotted fashion. So the general point I take it is that this hypothesis in its general form has no predictive power. It doesn't actually predict the fine-tuning of nature's constants, because the bare stipulation that there are teleological laws, there are laws oriented towards some end, does nothing to tell us what that end is. It's very parallel to the point we made about general and specific demons. The general hypothesis that there is a demon afoot doesn't predict anything about a coin toss. And the same thing holds for the general hypothesis that there are teleological laws. And then the point would be that fine-tuning on the general hypothesis is no more likely on teleology than it is on just random chance. But then, if we focus in on the specific hypothesis of there are primitive life-oriented teleological laws, it seems that once again, just like the specific demon, we've just shifted the improbability involved to just the likelihood of the hypothesis itself. And so there's this deep conceptual difficulty in actually getting a kind of like real, robust explanation of fine-tuning. What do you think there, Daniel?
I don't know as you lose all of your, I don't know as the shift perfectly cancels it out.
Right.
If you think it's like somewhat plausible that if there be an orientation, life would be a candidate, maybe it's not as good a candidate as the good, but maybe it's a better candidate than like polka-dotted salamanders or whatever. On the other hand, there might be a way to argue that this itself is just another form of fine-tuning. If you think of the end towards which a teleological laws are pointed as a parameter that could have taken any of these various values,
Yes.
well then like it looks like there's going to be a kind of fine-tuning. Now it'll be less severe, I think, than like the cosmological constant, because there's going to be a bunch of ends that are going to get life along the way. Like even if it's oriented towards ceaseless suffering, you need some sufferers to do that. So I don't know if that's going to be like as severe a fine-tuning problem as the ones that we're considering. But it's worth pointing out that you can think of, like if you think of it in this way, you can think of these as laws that are themselves fine-tuned. But maybe that's not a problem, because like almost anything, like this is a point Luke Barnes likes to make, is that you could just as well think of fine-tuning as fine-tuning for stars, because it's not like turn the dials a little bit and you get a bunch of empty planets. It's like turn the dials a little bit and you get a bunch of hydrogen, or it kind of slips back in on itself as soon as it bangs. And so at that point, almost any sort of interesting end towards which the laws are directed are going to require stars. And then once you get stars, getting people is not that difficult.
I think what you're saying is what I say in the final paragraph of that section, which is that the proponent of the teleological hypothesis could adopt axiarchism and say that the reason we have life-oriented teleological laws is because it's good that there should be such laws. Right. The problem then is just that, well, if axiarchism, that kind of explanation can explain the origin of the laws, well, then just cut out the middleman and just install axiarchism itself.
No, it's going to be hard, I think, to keep this view from collapsing into a version of axiarchism. And then insofar as you manage that, then you're going to have some of the probabilistic worries about the prior you were raising.
Yes. All right. So then what about the final version here? And then we'll wrap this up. I think we've been on a nuanced journey here that's extremely helpful for me, so I appreciate it.
Good. Yeah, no problem.
It's a dispositional teleology. Here it would be that natural processes have inbuilt tendencies or capacities to unfold towards various ends. Then the classic illustration of this is how an acorn has an inbuilt capacity to unfold into an oak tree. And we might talk about the oak tree as the natural end or aim of the acorn. And so similarly, perhaps the universe has a capacity to develop towards good ends like life and consciousness and reason. There's just a power or capacity within the universe itself. But here, the somewhat vague but still pertinent point about explanatory depth and what's actually being asserted kind of reemerges. Because cosmopsychism makes this same point, right? That the universe has a capacity to develop towards in various ways. But it grounds that claim in something I can wrap my head around. It's saying the universe is an agent and it makes choices for reasons. But if you delete that and we just talk about like the capacities of the universe, it seems like you've just repackaged what needs to be explained and just called it like a capacity. So my favorite illustration of this, where it gets more complicated, but it reminds me of a satire, The Imaginary Invalid, where a medical student, when asked how opium causes sleep, if you ingest it, you sleep, he replies that, quote, opium has a dormitive virtue, whose nature it is to make the senses drowsy. Like, there might be something to that explanation, but it seems like you haven't really explained anything. So that's kind of my worry about kind of this opaque appeal to dispositions.
This is my reaction every time somebody appeals to dispositions as explanations. Like, oh, we're doing dormitive virtues again. Let's bring back Aristotelian physics.
Right.
Like, that's effectively what this view is. Good luck.
Yes. Okay, so you would agree with me then?
Yeah.
Okay. And then when I go finally to compare theism and teleology, I kind of reiterate the same points, that it seems like theism will be the simpler proposal. And that you couldn't, I guess what I do more as a defensive move, where I say you can't do the same thing that we did with primitive teleology, where we distinguish the general and the specific hypothesis. It's far more difficult to do the same move when we talk about the general design hypothesis and the specific robust theistic hypothesis, because of these considerations about uniformity and simplicity. And if you grant those points, it will follow that robust theism has a non-negligible prior, and therefore there's just not this kind of parallel point to be made. And then I think the only difference here is that I give a different illustration, which occurred to me, is like, should we really think that the prior probability of the universe being eternal is negligibly small, because there are so many more finite possible ages for the universe to have than that required for an eternal universe, which is infinity? And it seems like, no, that's not right. An infinite amount of time for the universe to be here, that seems more intrinsically likely, to whatever degree we think, but more intrinsically likely than any particular finite age for the universe. And so if we can say that, well, then there's some plausibility in saying that the hypothesis of a God of unlimited power, knowledge, and goodness, that seems to be simpler and therefore more intrinsically likely than any other kind of quasi-theistic hypothesis.
Yeah, I think that's, there are some complications because of how many infinities there are, but if you restrict yourselves to countable ages,
yes,
then, yeah.
Absolutely, as always. All right, well, that brings to a close our exploration of 4 non-theistic hypotheses. Daniel, did you have any global comments you wanted to make of one kind or another?
Not really. I think we covered everything in the course of the discussion. This is a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Daniel. This is quality stuff. Like I said, I will go through again, listen to the whole thing and make the corresponding changes to my paper. But I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you.
Yeah, cool paper. I hope to see it in print soon.